January 17, 1944. 08:27 hours. 15,000 feet above Rabaul. The sky trembled. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto gripped the control stick of his Mitsubishi A6M Zero with the kind of reverence reserved for temple stones and ancestral swords. Through the canopy glass streaked with high-altitude condensation, the Pacific sprawled beneath him, an endless cobalt mirror fractured by islands like broken teeth. The morning sun, that same sun that had blessed the Emperor's divine lineage for 2,600 years, painted the cloud formations in shades of gold and crimson. It was beautiful. It was perfect. It was the last morning Yamamoto would ever believe the war could be won. His squadron, 9 Zeros in tight chevron formation, had launched from Lakunai airfield before dawn. Their orders were simple: intercept American bombers returning from their strike on Japanese shipping in Simpson Harbor. The briefing had been routine, almost mechanical. Intelligence reported the usual American formation: heavy bombers escorted by their twin-engine P-38 Lightnings. Formidable, but predictable. The Zero pilots had faced these before. They knew the dance. Climb above the bombers, dive through the escort screen, shred the B-24s with 20mm cannon fire, then spiral away before the Lightnings could respond. The Zero's legendary maneuverability made it a weapon of artistry in the hands of a skilled pilot, and Yamamoto was skilled. 19 confirmed victories. 2 years of combat stretched across the burning islands from Guadalcanal to the Solomons. He had seen boys become ghosts and machines become coffins, but he had survived because he understood one fundamental truth. The Zero was built for speed and agility, and American aircraft were built heavy, slow, and straight. That truth was about to shatter at 3,000 feet per minute. The radio crackled. Yamamoto's wingman, Ensign Kobayashi, young and still believing in the propaganda prints that showed Japanese pilots as modern samurai cleaving through waves of inferior American metal. Formation ahead, 2 o'clock, Angels 20. The American bombers were visible now, dark specks crawling across the sky like beetles across paper. But something was wrong. Yamamoto's eyes, trained by 1,000 combat sorties, scanned the surrounding airspace with the methodical precision of a man who understood that death arrived in the seconds you stopped looking. There, 6 o'clock low, at not the familiar twin-boom silhouette of the P-38. Something else. The aircraft rising toward them were different, broader, heavier in appearance, with inverted gull wings that gave them the profile of seabirds carved from midnight. They climbed at an angle so steep it seemed to defy physics, the winter sun glinting off their dark blue paint schemes. Yamamoto felt his breath catch. He had heard rumors in the mess hall, whispered warnings from pilots who had survived encounters over the Central Solomons. The Americans had a new fighter, something fast, something brutal. But rumors were wind, and wind could not kill you. This was not wind. The American formations did not climb like the Zeros. They did not spiral upward in graceful arcs, conserving fuel and maintaining formation integrity. They simply rose like shells fired from cannons, and engines screaming with a sound that carried even through the thin air at altitude. Yamamoto checked his altimeter. 15,000 feet. The Americans had been at 10,000 just moments before. Mathematics became horror. 5,000 feet in less than 2 minutes. His mind, trained in the cold arithmetic of aerial combat, performed the calculation automatically. 3,000 feet per minute. Impossible. To understand the terror crystallizing in Yamamoto's chest that January morning, one must step backward through the smoke of war to the year 1940, when the Mitsubishi A6M Zero first entered service with the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Zero was a revelation, a fighter so advanced, so superior to anything fielded by Western powers that it rewrote the rules of aerial combat. With a maximum speed of 331 miles per hour, at a service ceiling above 33,000 feet, and a turning radius that allowed it to literally fly circles around enemy fighters, the Zero dominated the skies over China, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. American pilots who encountered it in the war's early months spoke of it with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. The Brewster Buffalo, the F-4F Wildcat, these were the fighters America sent into battle in 1941 and 1942, and they died by the hundreds. The Zero could outturn them, outclimb them, outrange them. Japanese pilots were trained to exploit these advantages with a tactical doctrine built on aggressive dogfighting. Close-in knife fights where the Zero's maneuverability made it virtually untouchable. But there was a cost to this perfection, a trade-off that Japanese engineers accepted as necessary. And to achieve its remarkable performance, the Zero sacrificed armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks. The aircraft was light, dangerously light. A philosophy emerged from this design. The best defense was never being hit. And for 2 years, that philosophy held. Japanese pilots racked up kill ratios that seemed fantastical. They believed themselves invincible not through arrogance, but through repeated empirical validation. The numbers did not lie. The victories were real. The Americans were inferior. Then the Corsair arrived. Chance Vought Aircraft Company began work on the F4U Corsair in 1938, responding to a United States Navy specification for a carrier-based fighter with unprecedented performance. The requirement seemed almost absurd. A single-seat fighter capable of exceeding 400 miles per hour while carrying heavy armament and sufficient fuel for extended combat air patrol. The engineering challenges were immense. To achieve such performance, Vought designers wrapped the airframe around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a massive 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. For perspective, this was nearly twice the horsepower of the Zero's Nakajima Sake engine. But power alone was insufficient. The enormous 13-foot propeller required to harness that power created ground clearance problems for carrier operations. The solution was unorthodox: the distinctive inverted gull wing, it bending downward from the fuselage root before angling upward to the wingtips. This configuration allowed shorter, stronger landing gear while maintaining propeller clearance. The prototype first flew on May 29, 1940, and immediately demonstrated performance that stunned Navy observers. Maximum speed exceeded 400 miles per hour. Rate of climb approached 3,000 feet per minute. But the Corsair was a brute. Difficult to land on carrier decks, prone to stalling in low-speed approaches, with a long nose that obscured forward visibility during the critical moments of carrier landing. The Navy initially rejected it for carrier operations, relegating early production models to land-based Marine Corps squadrons. This was seen as a failure, a compromise. The Corsair was too powerful, too aggressive, too much for the precise ballet of carrier aviation. The Japanese never imagined this failure would become their nightmare. The Marine Corps squadrons that received the first operational Corsairs in late 1942 were based in the Solomon Islands, that chain of jungle-covered volcanic rocks where America and Japan bled each other across airstrips carved from rainforest. These men, many of them survivors of Guadalcanal's savage air battles, approached the Corsair with skepticism. They had learned to respect the Zero through brutal experience. They had watched friends die in wildcats that could not match the Zero's climb rate or turning radius. Now they were being handed an aircraft that weighed twice as much as a Zero, was less maneuverable, and had a reputation for killing inexperienced pilots during landing. But in combat, just the Corsair revealed a truth that transcended dogfighting doctrine. Energy was destiny. The first principle of energy fighting was simple. Altitude and speed could be converted into each other, and the aircraft that controlled the vertical dimension controlled the engagement. The Corsair's massive engine and efficient aerodynamics gave it a rate of climb that no Japanese fighter could match. From the first combat encounters in February 1943, Marine Corps pilots developed a tactical doctrine built entirely around this advantage. They would not dogfight. They would not turn. They would climb above the enemy, dive at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, make a single firing pass with their 6.50 caliber machine guns, then use their excess speed to zoom climb back to altitude. The Japanese called these attacks hit and run and denounced them as cowardly. But the kill ratios told a different story. By mid-1943, Corsair squadrons were achieving ratios exceeding 10 to 1. The Zero, once invincible, became prey. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound. They had been trained in a warrior culture that prized individual skill, aggressive spirit, and close combat. The Corsair negated all of it. Japanese aces with dozens of victories found themselves helpless as American fighters climbed above them faster than they could respond, then struck from angles they could not defend. The Zero's maneuverability, once its greatest asset, became irrelevant when the enemy refused to turn. Imagine a master swordsman facing an opponent who simply shoots him from 50 yards. All the skill, all the training, all the spirit meant nothing against physics. And the Corsair climbed at 3,000 feet per minute. 0829 hours. The engagement. Yamamoto pushed his throttle forward and hauled back on the stick, initiating a climbing turn toward the American formation. The Zero responded beautifully, gracefully, arcing upward in a spiral that would have easily outclimbed any aircraft he had previously faced. The altimeter needle rotated steadily, 16,000 feet, 17,000. His squadron followed, 9 fighters executing the maneuver with the synchronized precision of a kabuki performance. This was what they trained for. This was what the Zero was built to do. The American aircraft kept climbing faster. Through his canopy, Yamamoto watched the gap close, not through his own ascent, but through the Americans' determination to dictate the terms. They were not evading. They were not fleeing. They were coming up to meet him, climbing through his altitude advantage like it was made of paper. He could see them clearly now. The gull wing silhouette unmistakable. The dark blue paint scheme that earned them the nickname Blue Angels among American sailors. 6 of them, climbing in loose formation, and behind them he could see more rising from below like bubbles in boiling water. The radio erupted with warnings. Kobayashi's voice no longer calm. "They're too fast! The transmission cut off. Yamamoto snapped his head right in time to see Kobayashi's Zero disintegrate. One moment it was there, elegant and deadly, the National Sun insignia bright against the fuselage. The next moment it was debris, wings separating, the engine tumbling, a spray of fuel igniting into a fireball. A Corsair flashed past the explosion, having dove from above at a speed Yamamoto's mind struggled to process. He had not seen it coming. None of them had seen it coming. The Americans had climbed above their climbing attack, then dove through the formation faster than reaction time allowed. The discipline of Yamamoto's formation evaporated. 9 fighters became 9 individuals, each pilot reverting to instinct. Some dove, trading altitude for speed. Others broke into defensive turns, attempting to use the Zero's legendary maneuverability to evade. Yamamoto himself rolled inverted and pulled through, scanning the sky in 360-degree sweeps, looking for targets, looking for threats, looking for anything that made sense. What he saw was slaughter. The Corsairs had regained altitude. Already. The dive attack that should have cost them their energy advantage had somehow been converted back into altitude through sheer power. They were above the Zeros again, reforming for another pass. Yamamoto's mathematical mind, still functioning despite the adrenaline flooding his system, performed another calculation. The Corsairs had dove perhaps 4,000 feet in their attack run. They had regained that altitude in less than 90 seconds. The physics were undeniable. The Americans had more than enough power to dictate every aspect of the engagement. A second Zero exploded. Warrant Officer Sato, a veteran of 2 years, 21 victories, dead in the time it took to blink. The Corsair responsible did not even slow down. It simply climbed away, its engines roaring with that distinctive deep-throated thunder that would haunt survivors' dreams for decades. Yamamoto made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months prior. He dove, not to attack, not to reposition, to flee. He pushed the stick forward and pointed the Zero's nose toward the ocean 15,000 feet below, firewall throttle, accepting the shame because shame was preferable to death. His airspeed indicator climbed, 250 knots, 300, 350. The Zero was fast in a dive, but glancing back over his shoulder, he saw the Corsairs adjusting, angling their dives to pursue. They were gaining. At these speeds, the Zero's lightweight construction became a liability. The controls stiffened, the airframe began to shudder. The American aircraft, built heavy and strong, stable and unyielding, dove faster and more controlled. At 5,000 feet, Yamamoto pulled out of the dive, G-forces pressing him into his seat, vision tunneling to gray at the edges. The Zero's airframe groaned but held. He leveled out 20 feet above the wave tops, flying toward Rabaul at maximum continuous power, waiting for the hammer blow that would send him into the water. It never came. The Corsairs, having made their point, having claimed their kills, climbed back to altitude to continue escorting the bombers. They did not pursue fleeing enemies. They had missions to complete, and they had fuel to consider, and they had proven what needed proving. Yamamoto landed at Lakunai 30 minutes later. Of the 9 aircraft that had launched that morning, 5 returned. The other 4 pilots, 4 aircraft, if 4 years of training and experience, simply ceased to exist in the span of 3 minutes. The ground crews approached the returning Zeros and saw something they had not seen before. Pilots who would not speak, who sat in their cockpits staring at instruments that had betrayed them. Altimeters and rate of climb indicators that had promised them superiority and delivered them to the edge of annihilation. That night, in the officers' quarters, Yamamoto wrote in his personal journal. The entry was brief. They climb like angels. We are beneath them now in every sense. The sky no longer belongs to us. The numbers told a story that Japanese high command initially refused to believe. In the first 6 months of Corsair operations, February through July 1943, Marine Corps squadrons achieved a kill ratio of 11.3 to 1. Or for every Corsair lost in combat, more than 11 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. By war's end, that ratio would climb to 11.5 to 1, among the highest of any fighter aircraft in history. The Corsair's combination of speed, climb rate, firepower, and ruggedness created a capability imbalance so severe that Japanese pilots began referring to encounters with the distinctive gull-wing fighters as certain death missions. But the psychological impact went beyond simple numbers. The Zero had been more than an aircraft. It had been proof of Japanese technological and spiritual superiority. Its dominance in the war's early years validated the entire national narrative. That Bushido spirit combined with engineering excellence made Japan invincible. As the Zero's lightness was not a weakness, but a reflection of Zen principles, the elimination of unnecessary elements, the perfection of purpose through simplification. Japanese propaganda celebrated this. Posters showed Zeros dancing through the sky while heavy, clumsy American fighters fell like stones. The Corsair destroyed that narrative by simply climbing faster. American pilots who flew the Corsair described it in terms that revealed a fundamentally different philosophy of warfare. They spoke of power reserves, the ability to accelerate, to climb, to absorb punishment, and continue fighting. They appreciated the armor plate behind the seat, the self-sealing fuel tanks that could take 20mm cannon hits and keep feeding the engine. They valued the 6.50 caliber machine guns that could saw through enemy aircraft at ranges the Zero's lighter armament could not match. Where Japanese design emphasized perfection through reduction, American design emphasized capability through abundance. This was not merely engineering. It was ideology made manifest. Consider the R2800 engine that powered the Corsair. It consumed fuel at a rate that Japanese logistics officers would have considered wasteful, as much as 150 gallons per hour at maximum power. A Zero's engine burned perhaps 40 gallons per hour, but the American industrial base could produce fuel in quantities that made such consumption irrelevant. Tankers crossed the Pacific in convoys, delivering millions of gallons to forward bases. American carriers had fuel stores that would have supplied entire Japanese air groups for months. The Corsair's voracious appetite was not a flaw, but a reflection of confidence. Confidence in supply lines, confidence in industrial capacity, confidence that the material foundation of warfare favored those who could produce and transport resources at scales the enemy could not imagine. Every time a Corsair climbed 3,000 feet per minute past struggling Japanese fighters, it was demonstrating not just superior technology, but superior national capacity. The message was brutal in its simplicity. We have more of everything, and we are not afraid to use it. March 1944. Personnel records, Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. The attrition statistics from the Rabaul sector made for grim reading. Experienced pilots, men with 1, 2, and 3 years of combat operations, were dying at rates that exceeded the training pipeline's ability to replace them. Worse, the new pilots arriving from Japan were qualitatively inferior to their predecessors. The rigorous training programs that had produced the elite carrier pilots of 1941 had been shortened by necessity. Fuel shortages limited flight hours. Experienced instructors were dead. New pilots arrived at forward bases with perhaps 200 hours of flight time versus the 800 hours typical of pre-war training. They were sent against American pilots who had survived multiple combat tours, flying aircraft with performance advantages so substantial that skill became secondary. The psychological toll on surviving veterans was perhaps more significant than the material losses. Yamamoto flew 43 more missions after that January morning. He survived the war, one of the few, and in post-war interviews conducted by American military historians, he described what it meant to face the Corsair repeatedly. We knew from the moment we took off that we were inferior. Not as pilots, I remained proud of Japanese pilot skill to the end, but as weapons systems. The Corsair pilot did not need to be better than you. He simply needed to climb above you and dive. If you ran, you proved yourself a coward, but might survive. If you fought, you proved yourself brave, but would die. These are not choices warriors should face. The term weapons system in Yamamoto's statement is revealing. By 1944, even die-hard believers in samurai spirit recognized that modern aerial combat had transcended individual skill. The aircraft, the engine, the fuel supply, the radio equipment, the armor protection, the ammunition load, all of these elements combined to create an integrated capability that either matched or exceeded the enemy's capability. Spirit could not add 200 horsepower to an engine. Determination could not increase rate of climb. The romantic notions of aerial combat as individual duels between knights of the sky had given way to industrial arithmetic. And in that arithmetic, the Corsair's 3,000 feet per minute climb rate was a number that could not be answered. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, beating heart of the Corsair, was itself a symbol of American industrial philosophy. The design philosophy behind it emphasized reliability and maintainability over theoretical efficiency. Yes, the engine could run for hundreds of hours between overhauls. It could sustain damage, losing one or two cylinders, and continue operating at reduced power. It was designed to be maintained by mechanics with moderate training using standardized tools. This approach contrasted sharply with Japanese engines, which required more careful handling, more frequent maintenance, and more specialized knowledge. In practice, this meant that American squadrons maintained higher operational readiness. A greater percentage of aircraft were flyable on any given day. Maintenance crews could work faster, turning aircraft around more quickly. The cumulative effect was that American air groups could sustain higher sortie rates, keeping more fighters in the air more often. The Corsairs' abundance of power was matched by an abundance of availability. Yet there was poetry in this, though not the poetry of haiku or cherry blossoms. It was the poetry of logistics, unglamorous, unromantic, but ultimately decisive. Wars are won not by the most elegant weapon, but by the weapon that can be produced, transported, maintained, and operated in sufficient quantities to achieve strategic objectives. The Corsair's ability to climb 3,000 feet per minute was impressive. Its ability to do so repeatedly, day after day, mission after mission, across thousands of miles of ocean and dozens of forward bases, was crushing. October 1944. The Philippines. The Corsair had evolved by this point. Early production difficulties had been resolved. Carrier qualification issues had been addressed through improved pilot training and minor design modifications. And the F4U was now operating from fleet carriers alongside its land-based Marine Corps cousins. The sight of Corsairs launching from carrier decks, engines roaring with that thunderous baritone, became one of the iconic images of the Pacific War. They flew combat air patrol over the fleet, they escorted strike aircraft, and increasingly, they delivered their own ordnance, bombs, rockets, napalm. The Corsair had become not just a fighter, but a fighter-bomber, its powerful engine and sturdy airframe allowing it to carry external weapons loads that would have crippled a Zero. Japanese pilots facing these formations developed new tactics born of desperation. Some attempted to engage American fighters from directly below, where the Corsair's high-speed climb was less effective. Others tried to separate individual aircraft from formations through coordinated attacks. Still others resorted to ramming, the ultimate expression of spirit over material. All of these tactics achieved occasional success, but they could not alter the fundamental imbalance. For every Corsair shot down, 10 or 12 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that could replace losses. In October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Corsair squadrons flew nearly continuous combat air patrol missions over the American fleet. Japanese kamikaze attacks, themselves an admission that conventional tactics no longer worked, faced intercepting fighters that climbed to altitude faster than the suicide aircraft could react. The Corsair's rate of climb made it the ideal anti-kamikaze weapon. Radar pickets would detect incoming raids, vector Corsairs toward the threats, and the fighters would climb to intercept altitude in minutes rather than the quarter hours required by earlier aircraft. Many kamikaze pilots died never reaching their targets, shot down by fighters that seemed to materialize above them as if teleported by American science. The Japanese called the Corsair "whistling death," a reference to the distinctive sound its engine made at high power settings, a sound that became synonymous with defeat and terror. The name was accurate in ways beyond acoustic description. The Corsair whistled because air passing through the engine cowling oil coolers created a resonant tone. But the deeper truth was that the aircraft represented a kind of death that Japanese military culture struggled to contextualize. Death from industrial superiority, death from resource abundance, death from engineering that prioritized power over elegance. To a Japanese pilot trained in the aesthetic principles of wabi-sabi, the beauty of impermanence and imperfection, there was something almost obscene about the Corsair. It was too much. Too much power, too much fuel consumption, too much weight, too much of everything. It violated the principle of refinement, of achieving more with less. The Zero was beautiful in its minimalism. The Corsair was brutal in its excess. But excess, American strategists understood, was not a flaw, but a feature. The United States had entered the war with an industrial base capable of producing aircraft, engines and weapons at rates that Axis planners dismissed as propaganda. By 1944, those impossible production figures were being exceeded. American factories delivered more than 96,000 aircraft that year. Pilot training programs graduated more than 60,000 new pilots. The fuel refineries of Texas and California produced more gasoline than Germany and Japan combined. This was not luck or accident. It was the deliberate result of economic systems that prioritized mass production, standardization, and efficiency at scale. The Corsair climbing at 3,000 feet per minute was the tip of this industrial iceberg. Behind every sortie lay thousands of workers, hundreds of factories, dozens of transport ships, a logistics network spanning continents. What the pilot strapped into that cockpit carried not just 6 machine guns, but the weight of American industrial civilization. The Japanese pilot watching that Corsair climb away from him was not just facing a superior aircraft, he was facing an economic system that could outproduce, outsupply, and ultimately outlast his own nation's more limited industrial capacity. The symbolic object here was not a weapon or food, but altitude itself, the vertical dimension that the Corsair dominated through sheer excess of power. Every foot of altitude gained was a foot closer to invulnerability, a foot further from the reach of enemies constrained by lesser engines and limited fuel. Altitude was abundance made visible. It's 1945. Okinawa. The air war had become a form of massacre. Japanese pilots, many of them teenagers with minimal training, flew obsolete aircraft against American formations that included not just Corsairs but also P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, and F-6F Hellcats, all fighters with performance characteristics far superior to anything Japan could field. The kamikaze strategy, initially shocking, had become predictable. American radar, fighter direction, and combat air patrol procedures had evolved to counter suicide attacks with brutal efficiency. Corsair squadrons based on Okinawa and operating from carriers offshore flew up to 4 sorties per day per pilot. The aircraft's ruggedness and reliability made this possible. Marine Corps pilots spoke of the Corsair with an affection that bordered on reverence. The aircraft absorbed battle damage that would have destroyed lighter fighters. It brought pilots home with cylinders shot away, with hydraulics failures, yet with control surfaces shredded by shrapnel. One legendary incident involved a Corsair that returned to base with most of its tail section destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. The pilot had controlled the aircraft using throttle and trim tabs alone. For Japanese defenders watching these aircraft approach, the psychological impact was total. The distinctive silhouette, the sound of those R2800 engines, the knowledge that resistance was futile, all of it combined to create a sense of inevitable doom. Survivors of Okinawa's air defense operations described waiting in revetments for attacks they knew would come, watching Corsairs circle overhead at altitudes their own aircraft could not reach, knowing that escape was impossible and death was patient. And the Corsair's climb rate meant that American fighters controlled not just the horizontal battlefield, but the vertical dimension above it. They could reposition faster, respond to threats more quickly, and maintain combat air patrol stations longer. The 3,000 feet per minute rate of climb was not just a performance specification, it was temporal dominance. Time itself became an American weapon. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast. The war ended not with a final climactic battle, but with an acknowledgement of industrial reality. Japan's cities were burning from B-29 raids that Japanese fighters could no longer prevent. The atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki had demonstrated that American technological superiority extended beyond conventional weapons into realms that seemed like science fiction. Yet as the Soviet Union had entered the war, overwhelming Japanese forces in Manchuria, but perhaps most significantly, the daily arithmetic of combat had become unsustainable. Japan was losing aircraft, pilots, fuel, and material at rates that could not be replaced. The training pipeline had collapsed. Fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. The industrial base had been bombed into rubble. Against this backdrop of comprehensive defeat, the Corsairs' dominance seems almost redundant. But to the surviving Japanese pilots, it remained the most tangible symbol of why the war had been lost. They had faced an enemy who could afford to build fighters that consumed fuel profligately, who could armor them heavily, who could power them with engines producing twice the horsepower of Japanese designs, and who could deploy them in numbers that turned the sky dark. The Corsair climbing at 3,000 feet per minute was not just defeating Japanese fighters, it was demonstrating the impossibility of victory against an industrial system operating at a completely different scale. In post-war interviews, multiple Japanese pilots used similar language to describe their experience. They spoke of feeling crushed, not by individual defeats, but by the relentless consistency of American material superiority. Every engagement reinforced the same lesson. Every dogfight proved the same theorem. Individual skill, aggressive spirit, willingness to die. None of it mattered against enemies who could simply climb above you faster than you could respond. Epilogue. There is a museum in Chiron, Japan. It is dedicated to the kamikaze pilots who flew their final missions from that base. Among the exhibits are personal effects, final letters, and photographs of young men who chose death over surrender. The museum treats these men with respect, honoring their sacrifice while acknowledging the tragedy of their situation. Visitors move through the exhibits quietly, contemplating the human cost of ideological fervor wedded to industrial inadequacy. In one corner of the museum, largely unnoticed by most visitors, is a small display dedicated to enemy aircraft. There is a photograph of an F4U Corsair, landing gear extended, approaching a carrier deck somewhere in the Pacific. The photograph is unremarkable, standard military documentation. But beside it is a quote from a Japanese pilot interviewed in 1982 and 3 decades after the war's end. "We believed spirit could overcome material disadvantage. The Corsair taught us otherwise. It climbed faster than our faith could justify, and it killed with an efficiency that had nothing to do with courage. In the end, we were not defeated by better warriors, but by better resources. This is a hard truth for warriors to accept." The Corsair's rate of climb, those 3,000 feet per minute that so shocked Lieutenant Yamamoto in January 1944, was never just about aerodynamic efficiency or engine power. It was about the allocation of resources in service of national will. It was about choosing abundance over efficiency, power over elegance, overwhelming force over refined technique. And these choices reflected deeper cultural and economic realities. A democratic industrial economy versus a militaristic centralized one, mass production versus artisanal craftsmanship, pragmatic engineering versus aesthetic philosophy. The vertical dimension that the Corsair dominated was ultimately the vertical dimension of industrial capacity. Japan could not climb fast enough to match American production. It could not generate sufficient fuel, sufficient steel, sufficient trained personnel to sustain the arithmetic of attrition. The Corsair's ascent at 3,000 feet per minute was a daily reminder, visible, audible, undeniable, that the war had become a contest not of spirit but of supply. There is a certain poetry in this, though it is the cold poetry of economics rather than the warm poetry of heroism. Wars are romantic in their beginnings, when flags wave and songs are sung. They become mathematical in their middles, when casualty reports and logistics assessments replace inspirational rhetoric. They end in exhaustion, when one side can no longer sustain the arithmetic. The Corsair could climb at 3,000 feet per minute because American engineers built engines capable of producing that performance, Because American factories could manufacture those engines by the thousands. Because American refineries could provide fuel in quantities sufficient to operate them. And because American logistics networks could deliver that fuel across thousands of miles of ocean to forward bases where mechanics kept those engines running through repeated combat operations. Every time a Japanese pilot watched a Corsair climb above him, unreachable and deadly, he was witnessing not just a superior aircraft but a superior national capacity, the physical manifestation of industrial abundance applied to military purpose. The war ended because one side had more of everything and could sustain losses that would have broken lesser economies. The Corsair's climb rate was just one number in a vast ledger of numerical superiorities, but it was a number visible every day to men who watched their advantage evaporate 3,000 feet per minute at a time. In the end, the sky did not belong to the most skilled pilots or the most dedicated warriors. It belonged to those who could climb fastest, and climbing required resources that only abundance could provide. This is the larger truth about freedom and democracy that Lieutenant Yamamoto's final journal entry approached but could not fully articulate. That free societies with industrial economies can, when pressed to total war, generate material advantages so overwhelming that skill and spirit become secondary considerations. The Corsair rose at 3,000 feet per minute. Japan's capacity to resist fell faster.